We've been taking a look at the events of the early church as seen in the book of Acts. And in the last couple of weeks, we looked at the first missionary journey that Paul and Barnabas took, where they went from Pisidian Antioch to Iconium, to Lystra, and to Derbe, and then back through those towns. And at the end of their journey, there were some Jews that were saying that Gentiles, they had to be circumcised and they had to obey the law of Moses to be saved. And so because of that, Paul and Barnabas and others, they were sent to Jerusalem to meet with the apostles and the elders, and they came to a consensus on how to work with the Gentile believers. And so they sent a letter to them saying, circumcision wasn't necessary, obedience to the law wasn't necessary, but here are some things that we would like you to do, things that we want you to follow, just, out of courtesy. And so that letter was sent to the Gentile believers, and it brought encouragement and strength to their faith. Well, now, Paul and Barnabas, they were considering taking their next journey to share the gospel. And as they're preparing to go on this journey, they see there's a disagreement that arises between them, between Paul and Barnabas. And we see this at the end of Acts chapter 15 and verse 36. It says, "Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, 'Let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing.' Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it wise to take him, because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work." They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. And so here's this disagreement that arises between Paul and Barnabas because of this person named John, also called Mark. And one thing we can learn from this instance is that, number one, disagreements can actually bring growth in our lives. Back in Acts chapter 13, we read the story of how Paul and Barnabas, they come face to face with a false teacher, a false prophet named Bar-Jesus. And Bar-Jesus, he brought opposition against them. And because of that opposition, great spiritual warfare takes place between Paul and this Bar-Jesus. And Paul addresses Bar-Jesus, and he proclaims to him that the Lord was against him, and that as proof, God was going to take away his sight, and God did just that. Well, the issue was, what happened here was that following that spiritual attack, John, also called Mark, he was with Paul and Barnabas on that trip. And so here's John Mark, and he's watching this unfold, and he sees the spiritual attacks and the spiritual warfare, and he hears Paul proclaim that message to Bar-Jesus, and he sees how Bar-Jesus loses his sight. And because of that spiritual attack, John, also called Mark, left Paul and Barnabas to go back home. Now, we don't know all the details of the event, but it appears that because of John leaving them in the middle of this journey, that it brought much distrust from Paul. That when Barnabas said, "Hey, let's take John Mark with us again," that Paul was like, "No, he deserted us the last time he was with us. I do not want him to go with us." And so Paul and Barnabas, they end up going their separate ways. And we're told Barnabas takes John Mark, and they go to Cyprus, and Paul chooses Silas, and they go through Syria and Cilicia. And so what we see, even though there was disagreement, with these two men of faith, God used it to send the gospel further. You know, they were going to go out as one team, but because of that disagreement, they ended up going two different locations, spreading the gospel even further. And what that tells us is that not all disagreements are bad. You know, some can and will be used to bring about growth, whether personal or emotional or spiritual. But there's to know that there's a place for us to agree, to disagree, and still be used by God. You know, you think about, I looked up some companies that were formed because of a disagreement. You know, Microsoft with Bill Gates came into being because he disagreed with his previous employer. And so because of that disagreement, they parted ways, and his company is one of the largest in the world. Or Netflix, the streaming company. I guess the guys that started that, they had a disagreement with their company the company they worked for, called Pure Software. And so because of that disagreement, they started this company, Netflix, which was one of the forerunners of all the streaming networks that are out there. Or even in the spiritual world, think of churches. How many churches have been born from church splits, from disagreements? Denominations have been formed because they couldn't agree on the mode of baptism or the place of communion within a service. And so, you know, God uses disagreements to move his message forward at times. And so if we have those disagreements with others, we need to realize that, you know, it's okay to disagree with others, because God can use that disagreement for his glory. So after that disagreement, they part and they go their separate ways. It tells us Paul and Silas begin their journey and quickly bring another person with them on their journey. And in Acts chapter 16, verse 1, it says, Paul came to Derbe and then to Lystra, so cities that he had already been to, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, but whose father was a Greek. The believers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. Paul wanted to take him along on the journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they traveled from town to town, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in numbers. And so this little tidbit of Paul and Silas going to these cities, going to Lystra, finding Timothy and wanting to add Timothy to their team, we can learn, number two, that change can be beneficial. And let me explain. You know, here's Paul and Silas. They arrive in Lystra, and they meet this man named Timothy, who was well known and he was well liked in the area. And Paul really wanted him to join them on their next missionary journey. So Paul, and it's an interesting truth. You know, Paul has Timothy circumcised because of the Jews that lived in the area. And you think about, why would have Paul had him circumcised? They had just delivered a letter from Jerusalem, from the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem, saying circumcision wasn't necessary. And Paul was going to the Gentiles. But when he takes Timothy on board, the first thing he does is have him circumcised. Even though Timothy's father was a Greek or Gentile, so he wouldn't have been circumcised. And even though they just had that letter, they received that letter. So you wonder why. Why would if he had him circumcised? Well, it wasn't necessarily a requirement for Timothy, but it was helpful in their work if he was willing to do so. By being circumcised, it would have stifled any arguments that may have come up among the Jewish believers. And so having Timothy circumcised just squelched some arguments, some opposition that they may have faced as they continued on in their missionary journeys. It wasn't necessary, but it did help in their case. Well, in the same way, there may be times when we will need to do things out of love for others, not because of a requirement. I think placing our own needs above other people. And sometimes we may have to change for the betterment of someone else. Maybe we are people that go to church every week. But one day, and I've shared this type of illustration before, one day you leave your home to go to church, and your neighbor is dealing with some issue, and is in need of help. Well, what would be more beneficial? To continue in my routine of going to church, or to set aside my time in church to go help my neighbor in need? What would be more beneficial? Now, there might be those that, well, what is Clark doing helping his neighbor? It's Sunday morning. He needs to be at church. It's not about them. It's about your neighbor that's in need. We may have to make a decision to do something or not do something out of respect or out of our love for somebody else. And I often bring up the topic of going into bars or drinking. I don't have a problem with that. And maybe I would need to maybe not go into a bar or not have a drink, even though we don't have a problem with it, but not to go through with it just to be more of a witness to somebody else. I don't know if that makes any sense. But showing love or having love towards other people to make necessary changes that don't affect our spiritual lives, but may impact those that we have connections with. And I think a good illustration of that is going to church on Sunday, and even though there's a neighbor in need, what's more important? Being in the Lord's house on that one day out of, even though you go every week, or being a light to your neighbor in that moment. So change can be beneficial. And as they continued on their journey through the region, Paul receives a vision from the Lord. And this is Acts 16, verse 6. It says, Paul and his companions traveled through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. And so here Paul receives this vision, but it happens because of, number 3, closed doors lead to redirection. They wanted to go to Asia to spread the gospel, but the Spirit stopped them. They tried to enter Bithynia, but again, the Spirit would not allow them to enter. So they continue on to the town of Troas, and it was in Troas where Paul receives a vision of this man from Macedonia crying out to him to come and help them. And it tells us that without hesitation, that they got ready and they left at once, believing that God had called them to share the gospel in Macedonia. So what began as closed doors to Asia, Bithynia, to other regions, because became a redirection to the place where God really wanted them to go. And so we really need to be aware. We need to be aware of this in our own walk with the Lord. Are there things that we want to do, but the door just keeps closing before us? I know for myself, I've had the desire it's been over a year of trying to get a group of young couples together. And we started meeting, I think it was on a Friday night. And we had a good couple weeks. But then it became very sporadic because of life. So we stopped for a while, and then I switched it to Thursday nights. And never really went anywhere. And it's like that door keeps closing for some reason. Maybe, do I need to do a different day? Do I need to just let it go? Do I need to? Is it the leader that's the issue? But that door keeps closing. Well, is there a redirection taking place? And we need to be aware of that. There are things that we are wanting to do. The door closes. What's the next step? Should we keep pushing through that door, trying to get it opened, or should we allow God to redirect us to where he wants us to go? Like Paul and Barnabas and his companions. He received the vision. He just went. He realized those doors were closed to Asia, to Bithynia. And here was the door opened when they went to Troas. And he followed that redirection. And because of that willingness to follow the vision, their missionary journey moved to a place that was open and receptive to the message. And we see this in Acts 16, starting at verse 11. We're told that from Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace. And the next day we went on to Neapolis. From there we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city in that district of Macedonia. And we stayed there several days. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. "If you consider me a believer in the Lord," she said, "come and stay at my house." And she persuaded us. And what this section tells us is, number 4, following God's lead brings opportunities. There were the closed doors, he redirects, and now here are some, following that lead, there's an opportunity. They followed the leading given through that vision that Paul had received. And they journeyed to Macedonia. And in their journey to Macedonia, it brought them to the city of Philippi. And we're told that they went out of the city on the Sabbath to hopefully find to the river, where hopefully they would find a place of prayer. And what that tells us, according to commentators, is that apparently there was no synagogue in the town or the city of Philippi. And the reason there would not have been a synagogue is that there wouldn't have been enough Jewish men in the city to have a synagogue built. And so that's why when they went to the river, there were several women there praying. And so Paul begins to speak to these women who had gathered together. And as he's sharing the message, the teaching led to the salvation of a woman named Lydia, who was a dealer in luxurious items from the city of Thyatira. And so here's this opportunity. He's preaching or teaching to these women in Philippi. And the woman that receives the message is from Thyatira. And may perhaps just this encounter with this woman named Lydia, that she was the beginning of the gospel message reaching the people of Thyatira. And Thyatira is the location of one of the 7 churches listed in Revelation. And it was simply because a door was closed, a vision was given, and they found this place to share the message in Macedonia in the town of Philippi. And their visit to Philippi was also the beginning of the Philippian church, to which Paul wrote while he was in Rome, and it's known as the Book of Joy, and the experiences that they had in Philippi. So the fact of the matter is, we never know what God may do in us, or for us, or through us as we follow him. You know, Paul and his co-workers, they had plans of their own. They wanted to go to Asia, but he stopped them. They wanted to go to Bithynia, but they stopped them. So they went on to Troas, and a vision came which moved them on to Macedonia and to Philippi. And with those closed doors, they did not push forward with their plans. Instead, they followed God's lead that was given to them through that vision. And as a result, they were sent to a region where the message was presented, and it was received, and the church grew. And so some questions that we need to ask ourselves, what plans have we been working on with little or no success? Like my group with young couples. Is God closing that door with plans of moving us in a different direction? We need to be aware of that. Is he redirecting us to where he wants us to go? Are we being attentive to his leading? Willing to go in the direction that he leads? That's tough. To say, okay, God is saying this door is closed, you need to shut that down, and you're going to move somewhere else. But we need to be attentive to that leading, because, we might be holding ourselves back. What might be holding us back from making the moves God is giving? Is it out of selfishness? Is it pride that's holding us back? Or are we trusting him to follow the lead that he is giving us? So as we go into another week, as we continue to learn to live out our lives for him, we need to remember that some arguments are not all bad. They can actually lead to greater outcomes if we will just trust in the Lord. Adjusting our lives for the benefit of others may actually bring potential opportunities. Doing things out of our love for other people may bring about opportunities to share the gospel. Moving away from those closed doors of opportunity may lead to a better path, that God has something better for us, a different direction to go. But to remember that following God will always, always, always lead to the place he wants us to be. So I pray that we are listeners, and that we are followers of the Lord, and that we are attentive to him, and that we will trust in him as he leads us as we go through our days. God bless you. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.